You've likely heard the story of the Sturmtiger, given the plethora of videos on that vehicle as well as its increasing popularity among tank fans. I will without a doubt cover that and other Tiger-based vehicles in this series, but for today, I want to look at a vehicle which is lesser known despite its similar design to the big-gunned feline. So sit back, relax, and let's discuss the Sturmtiger's little brother, also known as the Sturmpanzer, Sturmpanzer IV, or, as it's commonly known nowadays, the Brummbar. Before we get into discussing the Brummbar though, I want to give a special thanks to today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is a free-to-play game available on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and Series S, focusing on military vehicle combat. This means you can use all sorts of aircraft, naval craft, and tanks in cross-platform battles completely free. As many of you may know, this channel started out largely from my content on the game, so it's great to finally have them as a sponsor for these videos. More relevant to this video is that one of the many playable vehicles in game is none other than the Brummbar. So whether you enjoy a bit more of a casual experience with the arcade game mode, or are like me and prefer the realistic or simulator battles, I have no doubt you'll enjoy playing, especially if you squad up with some friends. So go ahead and check out the link in my description to not just get the game for free, but also a special bonus of a free premium vehicle and a 3-day supply of premium to get you started. Huge thanks to them once again for sponsoring. Now let's get into what you clicked on this video for. Before we even start on the history of this vehicle, it's important to address one common misconception about it, that being its name. Many of you, including myself, likely know this vehicle as the Brummbar, which translates roughly to Grumpy Bear. However, this nickname has yet to be found in any German documentation regarding this vehicle. That being said, it is not entirely incorrect to use this name, as it seems to have been used in several Allied reports from 1943 referring to the self-propelled gun. I will likely use that name as well as the name Sturmpanzer IV, as these are far easier to say than any of the others on this list, which it was referred to by at different times from various sources. With that out of the way, let's get into the story of this grumpy tank. The origins of the Sturmpanzer concept can be traced all the way back to June 9th, 1941. This began as a desire to somehow get a 15cm caliber weapon in combat, as previous designs using the older Panzer chassis had not quite met the requirements despite being produced in some quantity. In a new design submitted to Hitler by Alket in October of 1942, they proposed a vehicle that would utilize the Panzer IV as its base, but now with a casemate on top to house the gun. Seemingly, Hitler was satisfied with what he was shown, as his next request was for when the first units could be completed. For the armament, the 15cm Sturmhaubitze 43L12 from Skoda was selected. As with other large caliber weapons of the time, this used 2-piece ammunition, with the projectiles being loaded separately from the propellant charges. This was mounted in a ball socket mount also designed by Skoda, creating an effective shrapnel shield without hindering the traverse of the gun. Reportedly, Hitler was also interested in the idea of mounting a 21 or 22cm mortar on the same chassis, but this never really progressed. Like with many of these sorts of vehicles, the Sturmpanzer IV would be built using recovered Panzer IV hulls. This cut down on the needed resources as well as speeding up construction. Modifications were still made to these rebuilt hulls though, with some of the changes being visible in this photo. We can clearly see that the upper glacis was removed and part of the side armor was cut away as well to make room for the new casemate. The casemate itself was obviously the main change, with it boasting an impressive 100mm of armor at a 40-degree slope on the front with 50mm on the side at 15 degrees. An additional plate was fitted between these with additional angling from the front. For this first batch of vehicles, earlier Panzer IVs with 50mm of armor were selected, so 50mm of armor was bolted to the lower glacis plate and 30mm of added armor was fitted to the smaller plate below that, with only the mid plate remaining as 50mm frontally. This gave the machine impressive frontal armor, but on top of the gun, it added weight to the chassis. Further armor was added to the sides to bolster the weak 20mm of the Panzer IV's many of them were built on, increasing the middle section to 40mm. To somewhat make up for this, the Sturmpanzer IV was given wider tracks and updated running gear components to upgrade it to the level of the Panzer IV-G, which was at that time the most current version. As the removal of the upper hull also removed the original vision port for the driver, a replacement was needed. For the eagle-eyed among you, you've probably noticed that this new one looks quite similar to that found on the Tiger tank. This is exactly right, as these were reportedly taken from the Tiger P hulls following their conversion to the Ferdinand tank destroyer. A wooden mock-up of the design was completed in February of 1943, shortly followed by the first of the initial batch. In total, there would be 4 separate batches or series of the Sturmpanzer IV, but for this first one, which we are now referring to, a total of 60 would be completed. The first 40 of these were to be delivered on the 12th of May 1943 in order to be ready for the Russian offensive. Unlike many projects towards the mid to late war in Germany, these were actually completed on time, with 20 being delivered ahead of schedule in April and 40 more in May. Still, these vehicles would not escape from Hitler's bizarre decision-making as he ordered them to be classified as Panzerjäger or tank destroyers rather than going to the artillery branch. This would lead to the decision to use the Sturmpanzer designation as it prevented confusion with the Sturmgeschütz tank destroyers armed with 105mm Sturmhaubitze already in service. As I alluded to earlier, this initial layout of the vehicle was just the first of 4 different vehicle series. In total, there would be right around 300 tanks produced, with some sources saying 302 or 306. I tend to lean more towards 302 as this seems to have been taken directly from the production numbers. Following the initial batch of 60, production would halt until December, with it restarting and continuing until March of 1945. Unlike the previous Sturmpanzers, these new production tanks would now be on the Panzer IV-H hull. Changes would be made throughout the assembly of the vehicles, with the first change being a 50mm plate added to the bottom of the driver's viewport. This was reportedly done to help prevent shot traps. This change was also made to some or all of the surviving original Sturmpanzers, making them into Sturmpanzer Ausf IIs. Changes were also made to the roof of the vehicle to allow for a new sliding armor cover for the gun sight. Most noticeably though, the tanks received mounts for side skirts and began to be coated with Simmerit as with all German vehicles produced in late 43 and 44. It seems that with the new 80mm front armor on the Panzer IV-H hulls, they now no longer bolted additional armor on the front, meaning the protection dropped slightly. The second run of Sturmpanzers also consisted of 60 vehicles running from December 1943 to March of 1944. This was then followed by the Sturmpanzer Ausf III, which replaced the earlier Tiger viewport with an armored box. For visibility, the driver would now have a periscope rather than direct view optics. To help address some of the weight concerns caused by the limited suspension, a new version of the 150mm cannon called the 15cm Sturmhaubitze 43-1 was introduced. I'm not entirely sure when exactly the swap was made to this gun in the production of the vehicles, but as deliveries began in December of 1943, it's likely that it was at some point during the Ausf II run of vehicles. Production of the Ausf III would run until June of 1944, amounting to a total of 18 vehicles before the 4th and final series would begin construction. This 4th series, the Sturmpanzer Ausf IV, would be the most produced of all variants as well as featuring the most changes. The casemate was redesigned, likely to simplify production by eliminating the angled side panels. The armor values seem to have remained the same as no sources make mention of changes to it. The roof armor was reconfigured, allowing for new periscopes the commander could use rather than just a bare hatch as previous vehicles had been fitted with. Aside from the simplified superstructure, the Sturmpanzer was also given a ball mount machine gun above the driver. Similar to the Elephant refit of the Ferdinand, this was done to protect the vehicle from infantry, which it was fairly vulnerable to. Although some of the earlier vehicles would receive different numbers of steel road wheels, early Ausf IVs would have their wheels completely swapped for these. This does not seem to have been the case for the entire production, as later vehicles can be seen with varying numbers of steel wheels or none at all. The Sturmpanzer Ausf IV was built on both new production Panzer IV-J chassis as well as rebuilt hulls. As the war situation turned, production numbers were inconsistent, with delays impacting work. Still, a total of 162 of these were reportedly completed by the time production stopped in March of 1945. Alongside the main Sturmpanzer force, there was also a small number of Munitionpanzers completed which would carry additional ammo for them. These were largely unmodified, although at least some early ones were refitted to the same standard as the original Sturmpanzers. The hulls remained unchanged aside from the sheet metal roof over the turret ring, which could be opened and rotated to access the rounds carried inside. As for the combat history of the Sturmpanzers, far less is known. We do know quite a bit about where they were sent, but not much about their actual combat usage. Over the course of their usage, the vehicles were split into 4 Abteilungen or divisions, numbers 216, 217, 218, and 219. After the first Sturmpanzers were delivered, the crews in the initial 216th Division trained with the vehicles in France during May of 43. At some point during this training, it was reported that the assigned personnel were not just untrained, but essentially unable to operate the tanks. Nevertheless, on June 10th, they were sent east to participate in Operation Citadel, entering combat on the 5th of July, 1943. Within just 2 days, 5 Sturmpanzers had been totally lost, with another 17 disabled by mines, 9 of which were repaired by the 11th. 1 month later, in August, the 216th would be pulled back for maintenance and repairs before going back to the front in September. They would continue fighting along different bridgeheads, including alongside some Ferdinands at Nikopol, before being pulled off the front in late November. Once again, they were repaired, as well as refits being done to the Ausf II version, before being ordered to the newly opened Italian front following the Allied landings. The division would see combat across the Italian front, seemingly ending the war around the Lake Garda area. As for the 217th, they were assembled in March of 1944. After just around 6 weeks of training, they would then be sent to defend against the Normandy invasions, leaving for the front in early July. Over the course of the war, they would see combat across the Western Front, including the Ardennes offensive, until being captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945. The 218th were assembled in August of 1944 in 2 companies. The first company was sent to assist against the Warsaw Uprising and would then continue fighting on the Eastern Front, being completely destroyed in East Prussia. The second company was sent to the west to the area near Paris. The first company of the 218th was attempted to be raised again in early 1945, but would only have Stug 3s, never receiving any Sturmpanzers. The 219th was the final Sturmpanzer division of the war, being created in 1944. These vehicles and their crews would be thrown into the meat grinder that the Eastern Front had become, seeing combat in Hungary west of Budapest. Although this does give us some idea of the places the Sturmpanzers saw combat, it does little to tell us how they performed. For that, most of the information we have seems to have come from a captured German gun commander. According to the interrogators, his information was fairly reliable, but obviously this is not as good as if it were backed up by combat documentation. Seemingly, the Sturmpanzers were primarily used as offensive weapons, being employed against fortifications as well as against enemy armor in some cases with reportedly good effect. Although the maximum range of the gun was well over 4,000 meters, it was said to be rarely done in practice at anything beyond 2,500 meters. Another captured POW would contradict this, claiming a max range of 8,000 meters with an effective range of 4,500 against normal targets and 800 meters against armor. Both reported that the vehicles were used with tanks or assault guns to protect their flanks and would normally disengage if enemy tanks were encountered. The Sturmpanzer's continued production seems to indicate they did their jobs fairly well, but suffered the same issues as other German tanks. In one instance, a division of Sturmpanzer went from fully equipped to only 2 combat-ready vehicles in just 6 days. This seems to have been caused by the tanks being moved along a long section of mountain roads, resulting in numerous breakdowns. According to one of the captured POWs, these breakdowns in the Sturmpanzers were largely due to the final drives, as with many German tanks. No doubt, the lack of properly trained crews also hindered the vehicles, leading to additional breakdowns and likely worse battlefield performance. Without additional information, it's hard to tell whether these vehicles truly performed well in combat or if they were largely pushed by Hitler, as he seems to have been quite fond of the vehicle. In talks with Hitler about eliminating the 25-ton vehicle class to instead use the 38T chassis, the Sturmpanzer was noted as continuing despite still using the Panzer IV chassis. Prior to its combat debut, he also supposedly anticipated it would be popular with the troops. Whether this played into the continued production more than actual effectiveness is unclear at this time, though. As there were a fairly large number of these produced, it's no surprise that quite a few were either recovered or captured after being abandoned by the crews. As mentioned earlier, this led to the name Brummbar and a number of these vehicles surviving the war. 4 of the tanks remain today from what I can tell, with one original Sturmpanzer at Kubinka, a Sturmpanzer Ausf III in the US, which was originally at Aberdeen before being moved to Fort Sill, and 2 Sturmpanzer Ausf IVs at Saumur and Münster. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. One last thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring, and a reminder to use the link below to sign up and get your free premium vehicle and premium time. Be sure to let me know in the comments what you think of the game. Shout out as always to my channel members who support this content through their generous donations, as well as those of you who buy merch or follow me over on Odyssey. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to never miss a new upload. I'll see you in the next video.